Good evening, guten Abend, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen.
Good evening, dear colleagues. As the chairperson of the German Lost Art Foundation, but also due to the fact that we've had many years of friendship, I would like to welcome the keynote speaker of the evening, Bénédicte Savoy. And we asked her to be the keynote speaker of this evening because for this area of research that we have been dealing with yesterday, today, and will be tomorrow, she has done considerable work. Without her study, her preparatory work, together with her institute and her students, this discipline would never have developed as it has. So it is both an honor and a joy to me and everybody that you are giving this keynote speech, Bénédicte. I wish all of us an interesting evening.
I want to say hello to Wayne too, and now it's yours, Modest.
Right. Thank you. Thanks a lot, Gilbert. And it is indeed a pleasure and an honor for me to be in conversation today with Bénédicte. Now, many of you know her and her work, and sometimes we often open up by saying that we do not need to introduce, but I will do it nonetheless. So for those of you who are here with us today, I see 121 participants in this conversation. Professor Savoy was born in Paris in 1972, and since 2009, she has been or is Professor of Modern Art History at the Institute of Art Studies and Historical Urban Studies at the Technische Universität in Berlin. In 2016, she was awarded the Leibniz Prize by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft. Bénédicte Savoy is a member of the Berlin Brandenburg Academy of Science and Humanities, as well as of the German Academy for Language and Literature. In 2016, she was made professor at the Collège de France in Paris. For us in our field, her work has been important not necessarily in just opening a space for us to imagine different kind of futures, but challenging us to also look at ourselves and our own complicity in histories of undoing and unchange. She has been critical of the institutional frameworks in which apologies and inactions become mobilized into techniques and technologies that make certain things impossible. And it is around this conversation that Bénédicte will open up a set of ideas for us tonight, which we will, and then we will engage in a conversation after. Bénédicte, lovely to meet you, to see you. Welcome, and thank you already for this presentation.
And I'm so happy to meet you and also Gilbert. Ich mache das auf Deutsch, weil Deutsch
I'm going to be speaking in German because apart from French, German is my working language, and we can have the discussion in English later on.
And yes, to hear what you have to say. Ich fange an. Indem ich mich zunächst sehr herzlich.
By means of beginning, I would first like to say thank you very much for the invitation to speak on this topic, as Wayne just mentioned, which has been with me very much in the past years, or the other way around, which I have been very much involved in. The topic of this conference that brings us together is the long time, the duration of this restitution debate. And I would also like to take the opportunity to say thank you very much to the entire team of the German Lost Art Foundation, particularly Larissa Förster. When the idea for this conference came up, I was deeply involved in the research on the book Africa's Fight for its Cultural History, a Post-Colonial Defeat. And in this book, it's mostly about showing how during the 1970s and 80s in Europe, mostly using French and German sources, how administrations, authorities resisted systematically and in an organized way resisted calls for restitution. When I started with this work, I wasn't the first to do that. There were important works on the resistance that prevailed in Belgium in the 1970s, era von Borden, and others who started to look into this topic. So about 3 or 4 months ago, when we were thinking about this conference, it wasn't quite clear what was going to happen, and the events of the past days, what happened between France and the Republic of Benin, more or less closed the circle of my work that started 4 years ago. I will share my screen with you, and I hope that you will then understand what I mean when I say the fact that a conference as this one is planned now or was planned a year ago, and the events were faster than reality, and that changed everything. This is what you will see and hopefully understand when I share the screen with you. So, on institutional and other lies, this is the topic of today's presentation. The presentation is structured the following way. I don't want to talk for too long because I want to have an exchange of thoughts with Wayne and you, but nonetheless, this presentation is basically structured into 3 parts, and I will possibly spend 10 minutes per part. The first is called Why History, the second is called Institutional Lies, and the third, Not in the Service of the Truth. And as I already said, I would like to begin with the 3 days this fall, the 3 moments that we as the international community, and particularly myself with my colleague Fermin Sa, have experienced in the past 10 days for me, but not just for me, I think in general for the entire field of research and the future of world cultural heritage. These 3 days were of such tremendous importance that the entire set of coordinates has shifted for me. The questions that I'm raising under parts 1, 2, 3 are more or less questions from the world of the past. So for that reason, it was extremely difficult for me to prepare this presentation. During the preparation, I had the feeling that I was dealing with old, outdated questions that I was trying to put into words, and I have to admit it was a rather unpleasant exercise because I am convinced that we are now living in a new era. When my colleague and myself started to work on the restitution report for Emmanuel Macron, the then Minister of Cultural Affairs of the Republic of Benin, Oswald Emeki de Cotonou, said, as soon as restitutions to Africa will happen, and he didn't really believe in it, there were many people who didn't believe in it, but he said, if it were to happen, it will be like the fall of the wall or a reunification of the 2 Koreas. So something that on the one hand seems to be absolutely improbable, but if it were to happen, would bring about a change of the world and would constitute a tremendous event. And this is what happened 10 days ago. So yes, I mean, I said I'm asking for forgiveness but I was really serious because I thought it was very difficult to deal with these old questions that I now believe to be outdated. So 3 days in the fall, you might have heard of it. Since October 27th, 2021, there have been 3 important events in the context of this new ethics of relations that we were yearning for. And they went far beyond the history of France or the Republic of Benin. On October 27th, 2021, Emmanuel Macron and the Foreign Minister of Benin, Aurélien de Benessi, Finwisa, and myself were also present, presented in the museum or gave a speech to say goodbye to 26 monumental big royal pieces of art that, if you want to understand the importance of these pieces, they constitute 2.5 tons of history. So he said goodbye to those during an exhibition, which was an exhibition of goodbye to these pieces. You can see a photograph of the scene that was particularly made for this exhibition. The big difference with the usual exhibitions in that museum is the daylight, the fact that for the first time these objects are not in this magical reddish light, but were illuminated by natural light and were so much better to be seen on those lower pedestals. And in the back, on the back of these statues, you see so anthropomorphic presentations of 3 kings. I don't know who the third is because I have Gezo, Glele, and Deonson. And opposite of this row, the entire history, not only of the looting under bloody circumstances during the French colonial military event in 1892 in the kingdom of Abomey was presented. So not just the history of the disappearance of these objects, but also the story of their claims to restitutions carried out by different stakeholders. Christiane Dibourat in 2005, she was the first to start with this as a member of parliament of Guyane. She later ended up becoming Minister of Justice, but also the Conseil représentatif de Résistance Noire and other entities, including the Republic of Benin in 2016. So one big event, this speech given by Emmanuel Macron in the Museum of Dahomey, the Minister for Cultural Affairs from France, the Minister from Benin, the Minister for Cultural Affairs of Benin, the Emmanuel Casaré-Roux, who's currently talking, director of the Musée Dahomey, who was very much responsible for the entire success of this restitution process. So he was very much involved in that, including his entire team, the curator, who was and is responsible for these objects, was also involved. Gaël Bouchon. Now, the fact that this first act of restitution was emotional was not only due to the fact of it being the first part of a historic event and the end of a long period of waiting, but also that there were many colleagues from the university of Benin, many different ministries from Benin, because they participated in a scientific conference organized around this event. And it quickly spread in the social media. And it wasn't just an event reserved to policymakers. I show you this group picture because everybody tried to get into the picture, because this restitution is the fruit of a very intense, dignified, serious, long-standing cooperation between scientists of the Musée de Gaborone, different universities in France, and also the colleagues in the Republic of Benin. Gaëlle Bouchon, the curator of these objects, basically the mother of these objects, is the young lady that I've just pointed the cursor at. Now, that was the first act. The second act happened 10 days later. The president of Benin had not come to Paris because he didn't want to come and possibly return without the boxes, because the objects were exhibited and a period of 10 days was reserved to package them, to put them away, wrap them. So 10 days later, they were shipped to Cotonou, to the Republic of Benin. And Patrice came to Paris. There was a second ceremony in the Élysée Palace, a signing of the transfer of ownership. It wasn't the presidents who signed, but the ministers of cultural affairs, Jean-Michel Bimbola and his French counterpart, so that at the end of this very, very intense, emotional, and legally important 15 minutes, the objects, the tremendously big royal objects of power, were returned to the ownership of the Republic of Benin, and from that moment on, no longer in the responsibility of the Musée Quai Bruni. And then the third act, these 2.5 tons of history were put into 12 boxes, flown to Cotonou, and in Cotonou, the entire city was in a celebratory mood. There were huge billboards on the road between the airport and the inner city. People were spontaneously lining up along the road, or they'd come by bus through the entire country to Cotonou. The trucks that you can see on the right-hand side were welcomed on their way from the airport to the president, to the Palace of the President. And in the Palace of the President, they were welcomed in a third celebratory ceremony as the soul of the predecessors that returned, but also as objects of the Republic, as museum objects that had belonged to a king, the king of Dahomey, who was also represented by his predecessors or successors. So these royal treasures were welcomed in a big, emotionally touching ceremony in the open air, where the modern Benin, the civil society, the different representatives of the state, military, civil servants, ministers, they were all present, as were approximately 20 crowned heads, as they are called, their tête couronnée. And they were in conversation with the Republic of Benin and the President Patrice Delot, who you can see on the left-hand side, and they were talking with him, to him, and the negotiations that will now begin will focus on who do these objects now belong to, how will they be re-socialized. And that is all happening in a very strong, possibly also necessary Republican manner. As I said, it was a historic event because for the very first time, a colonial power, a former colonial power from Europe, i.e. France, bid adieu to a large part of the cultural heritage of Africa, which it had acquired in a violent way, a part that for 129 years had permanently been on exhibition in Paris, big pieces that were always shown in the African exhibit, first the Musée de l'Homme, then the Musée des Cabroni. And the event was historically important and very historically charged, opening up new perspectives because the small Republic of Benin, this small, not very affluent country, poor in resources, natural resources, this minute state of Benin was the first sub-Saharan African state, the first state on the African continent in general that succeeded following many decades of resistance to have a considerable part of its cultural heritage returned to it. The newspapers, the television stations, radio programs, everybody was reporting on this, and you see this here in this typical kiosk style in Cotonou.
And it was not just about circulating these statues, but it was about the property that was transferred. So they now became part of the property of the Republic of Benin. And it was a historic moment, not just because it was the first restitution of its kind, but also because France had been very hesitant in the past to agree to such a restitution. And just as a reminder, I'm showing you these documents here. I think this has not been something that was in the public eye in Germany at the time. It is often confused with the treasures of the king of Abomey, and oftentimes people don't understand the extent and the scope of these objects and the requests by the Republic of Benin and the history of these requests. And that is why I'm showing you these documents here if you want to take a look at this. So this is the official request by Borlian at Benoxy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Benin, and on the 12th of December. And the French president took his time. The government of François Hollande at the time had his foreign minister, Jean-Marc Ayrault, answer later to that. And I think a typical statement that really shows the resistance to this kind of request and the posture, as we'd say in French, and you can see here in the third paragraph, he said, les biens que vous écouvez ont été intégrés de longue date. And as you can see here in the third paragraph, he goes on talking about the cultural goods here that are the property of the French government and the French state. And they use a terminology that you not really use in everyday speech, really. So this is a very symbolic way of putting it, the conformement, as they're calling it here. And as you can see here in the rest of the paragraph, they are describing their reaction and their approach to these objects, the inalienability of these objects. So it is impossible to give them away, and it is also something that should remain in the property of the French government, and they're intangible in a way. So what is important here is the fourth paragraph here. As you can see, due to these three reasons, their restitution is impossible to do. Now, I think this was a legal framework that was created that was impossible to surmount, and to counter this as an argument in order to somehow reach an agreement. Now, what actually then happened was that the legal situation that stopped this from happening in the first place was changed by the Macron government and in consecutive steps. And it became apparent that societies and people can adapt to a legal framework, and it can move from a challenge to something else, to something that helps better handling certain cultural goods and collections. And again, a historic moment really is what happened here. And 1965, Paulin Jonatim said, born in the actual region where these collections came from, he said in January 1965, as the first argument and argumentative article that I'm aware of about the restitution of African cultural heritage, he said that, and I'm just referring to part of his article, as you can see here in the middle, la récupération légitime de nos arts plastiques pour rabouter le feu à ces mensonges, and so on and so forth, as you can see here. So he is basically saying that as an African people, we have been without culture, without history, and perceived that way. People considered us, without inventions, without any achievements. We've not been able to achieve anything. And what he says is that the restitution, the legitimate return of these cultural goods and of our cultural heritage is something that is going to rectify this historic lie that we don't have any history. It is going to remove that lie and correct it. So that's about 60 years ago. And well, this finally happened, this restitution, a legitimate restitution happened. And the idea that there were no cultural goods or cultural heritage and no history, that was finally corrected. Now, I highlighted this sentence here because he's talking about this historic lie, and of course that's part of what I want to talk about today, these lies that were spread in this context. And that leads me to the next part of my presentation, something that you might even call the more boring part of my presentation, because it's about the question of institutional lies and other lies beyond that. So the question is, why history, as I said earlier? And I think this is a discussion that might even be held in vain, because, and I'll tell you why. The photograph that you can see here happened or was taken in the Audimax in Berlin at my university in 1970, round about that time. And you might be familiar with the scenery if you've been to the university there. And you can see here in the middle Michel Foucault and André Guzman next to him, and that was a meeting with the title TU Nix, so Technical University, not doing anything, and that was 10 years after the student movement and protests in the 1960s. So I'm showing this because I want to talk about an interview of or by Michel Foucault, an interview where Michel Foucault was asked why or how he is making history, why he is writing about history, and the metaphors he's using. I think you're going to see that that's going to be quite interesting. Why does he want to talk about history in the way he does? And that, I think, is something that I shared, the sentiment I shared in recent years and months. And I think we've seen the results of that as well as I hinted at. And I think that makes it unnecessary in a certain way to focus on the historic dimension here. And as you can see here, there is the English translation of that interview, and he was asked what kind of historian he is, and what he says is that I am an artificier, so I'm someone that blows things up and also does fireworks. It's the same word here in French. So he is an arsonist in a way, you might say. And he says, I make something that ultimately serves a siege or war, or a destruction. I'm not for destruction, but only so we can pass down the wall, so we can advance. And that is the only way that we can really tear down the walls. And he goes on talking about an artificier that is primarily a geologist. As you can see here, they examine layers of terrain, the landscape that they're moving through, and he wonders, where is it easy to dig? Where is there going to be resistance? And he says that they examine how fortresses are built and what the foundations of these fortresses are. And once he's examined that, he knows how to proceed. And he later on in that interview says that ultimately, that the bomb explodes and you have a breakthrough. So this metaphor of destruction is not something that I'd use personally, but when I started working on these issues and the long history of restitutional struggles, for me that was an experience that was a bit like an X-ray of the present and the past. And you can see here the first sources that I looked at in the Musée Quai de Branly. And you can see here documents in French, but also in German and in English, of course. And this really showed the explanation that the present provided structurally. And I think it is an opportunity, a tool that helps us understand the body of the matter and why it reacted the way it did. The overall reaction to all the stakeholders in this debate about restitutions. So this fortress that Foucault talked about, that we've seen today, that we were facing, that really helped me understand this better, the situation that I was facing. And you will know, as you're familiar with the matter, there is a tremendous amount of material, of documentation about these issues of restitution, and there are a variety of lessons you can learn from that. From a political point of view, you can write a history of resistance, history of Africa. So there are really a variety of lessons to be drawn from this. And for myself, for my reconstruction of this debate, I tried to find my way through this documentation. But again, today I wanted to focus on institutional lies, because institutional lies are something that it seems to me to be a red thread that is present throughout this whole discussion. And it is something that creates a connection to us today. The institutional lies of the past are the same institutional lies that had been used just a couple of months ago, and that formed a blockade of the process that we wanted to move forward. And it was quite interesting to take a closer look at these past lies and to deconstruct them in order to better understand today's lies, in order to resolve and remove these barriers and challenges. Now, as this has been overcome, it was quite difficult for me now preparing my presentation today to go back to that and really look at all the details, the fact-checking, historical facts, things that were not quite close to the truth in the past, and to compare all of that and to really clarify all that. I mean, we've done all that and it was successful. So I think the horizon has widened due to the recent events. So I just want to mention a couple of examples about these lies. Now, in the Süddeutsche Zeitung, a German newspaper, Till Brieglieb wrote an article about this whole process, and they called this a triumph of a very focused or targeted lies. And he talked about this sinister club of gentlemen, the group of heads of museums and those that are responsible and were responsible in the 70s and 80s for these cultural goods, and how they got together in order to produce the statements with the challenges to restitution that we're still seeing today. So I think this is a geology or an archaeology that helped me understand that, using the sources of the time. And now I would like to start with the second part, the institutional lies themselves. And in philosophy, sociology, and in politics, there are a variety of studies about lies in a variety of languages as well. And I wasn't quite that familiar with the topic when I started looking at this, and I took a systematic approach to understand a theory of deceit or a systematic approach to deceiving, how that worked, if that existed at all, if that might be a tool, and if what I found in the past, and all of us encountered as we're working in these archives, how this might help us move forward. And one of these studies is from the 80s by Gabriel Falkenberg, Lies, and he looks at the theory of linguistic deceit. And he proposes a variety of definitions of lies in a variety of languages as well. And he derives a theory of lying from that. And I just want to summarize his conclusions. He compares these definitions of lies from Weigand, for example, on the fourth line here from 1873, who says that lying means not saying the truth on purpose. And Grimm said in 1885 that you knowingly tell the untruth or don't say the truth. And in 1943, Trübner said that you knowingly don't tell the truth, and you can use deceit in order to not tell the truth, and do that intentionally and knowingly, as Sanders said in 63. So as you can see here in the Oxford English Dictionary, it says that a lie is a false statement made with intent to deceive. So these are the definitions I want to use in order to develop the different levels and the typologies. It's truth, it's not saying the full truth. There are institutional lies, as we've heard, lies that are propagated through generations. So there are really such a variety of definitions and of approaches. And I don't really want to go into too much detail on this, but I want to rather tell you in what context this is useful to our work. And as you can see here, this is one of the first documents that we found in the archive of the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation. It is a document that stems from 2 years after the first request in May in the 1970s. That was 1974 is when where this document stems from. But they tried without success to request restitutions, and this request from 1972 led to a lot of mechanisms of resistance that really produced a lot of documents in their archives, but in Germany as well, and in the German-speaking world. And also looking at different questions in France, in Belgium, and in the United Kingdom. So all of that focusing as well on Africa, and in the Netherlands, focusing on other areas of the world. Now, this letter is a letter sent by the Director General, Stefan Wetzold, as you can see here, from May 74, Secretary General of the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation. And what he says is that in reply to the president, where he sends a statement by Dr. Kusmal that was given to the Ministry of Culture in the German federal state Baden-Württemberg. And what he says is that he thinks that the arguments used in that statement are quite valid as an argument against restituting any of these collections. And what I think what is quite interesting is that he's referring to a colleague from Baden-Württemberg with all his expertise from the Blinden Museum in Stuttgart, as you can see here. And it's also interesting that it is a statement by a Director General to his Ministry of Culture in Baden-Württemberg. So what we're learning from this, I mean, there are other sources, but what we're learning here is that the government of the federal state Baden-Württemberg in the early 70s, when this whole issue started to pick up steam due to the work of the United Nations and UNESCO, that this ministry and the government asked this expert in a museum for his expert opinion. And that statement and opinion of Dr. Kusmal was circulated amongst these circles. And as we can see here in this letter, that it seemed to provide valid arguments against restitution. And many of the relevant stakeholders were inspired by these arguments. And they were quite straightforward, to be honest, the argumentation that they used. They have, again, lots of documentation about that. And you can see here the introduction of that statement. So after extensive deliberations with all the relevant museums in Germany, they, the author of this statement, puts forth his opinion, and this also refers to the resolution by Mr. Usoseko, and you might be familiar with that resolution introduced by Mobutu Sese Seko. But coming back to the document here at hand, again, they've been in extensive deliberations with all the relevant museums here of ethnology and anthropology. So that is a summary of all the expertise that they collected. So this is particularly interesting, the statement here by Mr. Kusmal, because he is taking some liberties with the historic facts. So there are a variety of lies in these documents. You could really, and I've done that in the past, you could really list those lies and half-truths or wrong statements for pages on end. But what I think is interesting is that a director of a museum uses his expertise and his image in order to push certain arguments towards the political landscape that, again, as we've heard, were circulated among the relevant parties. So Friedrich Kusmal was not an expert on Africa. He's never been to Africa, and he does admit that at some point later during TV interviews. He says he has no idea, no expertise on Africa at all, but he's always willing to provide his expertise on these matters. And what he says, basically, in this statement from 1964, he talks about the freedom movements and independence movements in Africa. And he says that there was an overemphasis of their own dignity and their achievements and tradition and feeling of togetherness and society, and that these developments might have had a political dimension right from the start. So what he's saying with his image as a director of a museum is to provide a valuation or devaluation, rather, of these efforts of Pan-Africanism of the 1960s, something that had a very normative effect. And he says this was a great overemphasis of these developments. And he does that on the one hand, and on the other hand, he also very much hints at the political dimension and very much ignores the cultural dimension of these matters. Now, he could have given any kind of answer to the question that was put to him by the government of Baden-Württemberg. And what he ultimately does is that he uses a very generalized expertise that it does not actually apply specifically to Africa, to make quite a strong statement that does have consequences on the political stage. And what he says further down in the document is that very few people from Africa will probably be interested in these collections out of cultural reasons. So he's basically saying they're not interested in this due to historic or cultural reasons, but other reasons. And I think there are certain relations here to the quotes that we've talked about earlier, but also to poems and other political statements of the time. So I think there was a very strong, and it is proven that there was a very strong cultural interest in reconnecting to people's own cultural heritage, especially in the first decades after gaining independence, both on a material and immaterial level, talking about language, religion, but also their own art that countries and people produced. And now we are moving through this chronologically today, but I was thinking about other approaches when I started out. And at some point, I gave up on this idea to do a typological approach, to look at different ways to categorize these statements and talk about those. So this is just a chronological overview. Now, here we can see another example, again, from the archive of the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation from 1976. And this was a time when the public was much more aware of the whole discussion about cultural heritage and restitutions, and a lot of museums felt threatened by this. The German government and its ministries, the authorities in Germany, needed answers and information from museums on how to handle this on a political level. And what we can see here is part of the minutes of a meeting of the board of the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation. And this is what the president or the chair of that board said. So they talked about these issues, and they talk about the potential requests for restitutions by countries of the third world, as they put it here. And Secretary of State Thiele asks about whether the foundation could actually look at all the individual cultural artifacts and document the provenance. So what they're asking basically is whether the foundation can prove that all these artifacts have been acquired legally, and if they have that documentation. So it's about proof. And what the chair or President Vomit here says, the Director General of the museum, is a very concise and surprisingly straightforward answer. He says, yes, they say yes, they have that documentation for every single artifact that it was legally acquired. Now, I think if you've spent about 5 minutes with these issues, you will know that this is such a lie, because there is no documentation for every single artifact here. And we were talking about 75,000 artifacts from Sub-Sahara Africa here that were procured in one way or another. So yes, there are lists, there is correspondence, but a legally valid documentation of procurement is in existence. So they know this, of course, at this point in time when they gave the statement, but it doesn't stop them turning towards representatives here of the government and telling them that, yes, of course, they have this documentation. And we talked earlier about statements that are made in order to protect something and in order to limit the discussion and the extent of the discussion. And this is exactly what we're looking at here. And I want to come to my third and last example that is not focused on the political sphere. The museums used and designed a certain wording, a certain language for politics. And the public, on the other hand, if they received any kind of information in interviews, for example, there a different kind of rhetoric was used in order to use half-truths or lies. But I wanted to show you, what it looks like if these directors, museum directors, talked about these issues internally amongst one another. And here we can see this is a letter from August 1978 by the Director General Betzold. We've already heard of him. And he replies to a request by the new president, Werner Knopf, a new president of the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation. He is a legal expert, and he just wants to know about these developments. Now, during that time, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but they received a request by the Council of Museums, or this museum's council in particular, and they wanted to know what the risk was of restitutions, how many artifacts and assets were actually at risk due to these requests. And what he basically wants to know from his Director General is what the extent of that is. And what he says is that, of course, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, that potential requests for returns and restitutions, the whole number of collections from any kind of anthropological museums or archaeological museums, and all museums involved in this context are at risk, and this would amount to about 500,000 objects. So this is exactly what is not shared with stakeholders from the political sphere. They're not talking about this. They're, to them, just saying that they just have national interests that lead them to these requests for restitution. And they're saying that there's really no legal basis for this. But what they're saying internally is that a lot of these collections would be at risk due to these requests for restitution. And now I want to come to the third part of my presentation, in the service of truth or not in the service of truth.
I have shown that museums, their administrations in the 1970s and 80s were not interested in transparently managing the history of their artifacts. And there were reasons for this. And I increasingly asked myself the question, why? Well, they wanted to protect, but is that the best way to protect assets, spreading untruths or denying historically proven facts? Why were museums lying so much when at the same time we hear and know that they're scientific institutions? Shouldn't science be in the service of truth? And if so, what other truth is museums science pursuing? Something that is not in the service of truth. The sentence, not in the service of truth, is not something I coined. It's the result of an experience I made and which has been with me on a daily basis since then. It was a presentation during the training of young diplomats in the German Foreign Office here in Berlin. I think it must have been in 2019. I used some statistics, figures, and charts to explain how many artifacts from the colonial time had come to Germany, etc., etc. So it was all very precise. And at the end of this presentation, one participant, one of the most important people in this room, commented on my work, and he was commenting towards the audience and said, what Bénédicte just said is all true. It's all true. It cannot be refuted. But here at the office, that's how they always say it, at the office, we're not in the service of truth. And I was extremely speechless because in my naivete, I thought we are all in the service of truth. We, being historians, scientists, we all try to make historical facts, i.e. the truth, visible, put them in the right framework in order to take political decisions on that basis. And I noticed that there are other reasons, other motivations than truth. And it shocked me, and it continues to occupy my mind. We can talk about this later. But when museums, particularly in the German-speaking region, are seen as scientific institutions and present themselves as such, and harvest the symbolic capital that is inherent to the academia in Germany, then the question arises, how can this be brought together? How can you be at the same time a scientific institution and work on the basis of wrong statements? I'd like to show you an interview with Hermann Partzinger in July of 2017. I'm going to read and comment on it, and with that we can also open the discussion. Maria Osowski with RBB says, you just mentioned the history of science, Professor Partzinger. You are equally responsible for science in the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation and scientific work, including the presentation of artifacts. Can you prioritize and say one is more important than the other? So somebody is being introduced as a professor, but also somebody who is responsible for science in 2, 3, or 4 positions. So somebody is introduced whose word counts also with regard to the truth and on this quest towards truth and the need for transparency. And his answer is regarding the question, is one more important than the other? And he says, no, all institutions of the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation have a long-standing tradition as research institutions. It is naturally clear, and this is part and parcel of the Berlin tradition. And we do continue this with all of our awareness that science and research are the foundation of any kind of educational work, etc., etc. So he stresses the fact that we are dealing with places of science and academia, and this brings me to my written end of the presentation, which I have to look up now. So if this connection between the museum and science is so strong, the question of the institutional lie, which is so well documented, becomes central. As soon as museums are so strongly connected with this aura of science and lie at the same time, they lose the confidence that is given and put into them. And if the lie has become so inherently enshrined in museums, it becomes a substantial problem for their credibility and also for those who use the lie. And in the English-speaking countries, those who are responsible for the credibility of museums, for example, in the British Museum, are called trustees, i.e. people that you should and can put trust in. And my closing remark would be the experience of the past decades has shown that museums are not scientific institutions, at least not in the sense of an institution that is looking for the truth. And this would be my current answer, and I have a lot of proof for this, interviews from the 1970s and 80s, but I believe that because of these deliberate lies, museums until recently were not in the service of truth, but in the service of accumulation in the sense of the 19th century. But that this attitude has made them lose a lot of trust, had led to an increasing alienation between the museums and the general public, and they need to regain this trust now with intensive work. And as long as this trust is not re-established, it will be problematic for the museum culture. So let me close by reiterating again that all of these questions for me have been answered, highlighting this focused on opening up new pathways, new possibilities. And I believe that this has now happened. And I'm very much looking forward to the questions of the future and today's discussion, but also another set of coordinates with regard to questions, because the question of the lie has been answered, even though it's a little sad. Thank you.
Thank you, Bénédicte. There's so much that we need to talk about that I don't know if we have the time to engage in the conversation that we need to. And I will try and go in between moderating the questions from the public and just asking my own question. I want to start out in our conversation with perhaps my only big challenge, which is, what does a theory of lie look like differently for those who already, the formerly colonized, for example, who already was skeptical of colonialism as a lie, or science as a lie, of physical anthropology as a lie. So to think of the museum as a lie, as an infrastructure of lying now, does that say anything differently than an earlier criticism of the very foundation of the colonial project and its legal framework and scientific framework as a lie?
Mhm.
Yeah, what's the difference between those?
Vielen Dank. Ich bin nicht sicher,
Thank
dass
you very much. I'm not sure whether dealing with the lie is the center of hopeful steps into the future, but dealing with the truth, i.e., what type of truth are you looking for in museums, in the lists, in the episystems, in the different ways that museums have been accustomed to since the 19th century? You have to say that many things are really transforming, but whose truth, what truth or truths are being prioritized, and aren't historical facts so central that they should also be covered? We are seeing this, some first steps are taken in the Humboldt Forum in this direction under a considerable level of pressure, but I think the lie is connected to the truth. And based on my experience, I would also say that it is more important to follow the positive side.
Mm-hmm.
My sound is really bad. I have trouble hearing.
No, my microphone is bad. So is that better?
No, but es kann mit meinem Gerät liegen.
It might be because of my computer.
All right, let me try.
We'll just try.
But beautiful. I mean, there is something about your sketching of this moment, which I found wonderful, right? That sketching, because in just tying to what you just said, in the sketching of the moment as the fall of the wall, you sketch as such a hopeful moment that there is a change, that there is something that has happened. And as a person working in a museum, I'm hoping that is so. I'm really hoping that is so. So tying just to one earlier conversation within the last panel, where one of our speakers spoke about that moment by Macron. Are we supposed to now be more hopeful? Are we supposed to be now more optimistic that this inaugurates a new moment in the museal heritage infrastructure that is more just, redistributive? Or are we to be cautious? And what does this hope offer us actually?
Also ich glaube, wir können optimistisch sein, oder jedenfalls
I think we can be optimistic, or the example that we've just scene and the way it came about. This joyful seriousness with which the entire event was carried out, this professionalism, this shared joy, make me optimistic, but this is just a very vague feeling that I'm expressing. What I know from the historic perspective and from experience, that in the history of restitutions, only when the artifacts are returned, special or certain discussions within societies can begin. These discussions never begin. Who are we? How do we relate to it? How important are these artifacts to us? Are they spiritual, historical, philosophical, sociological points of crystallization, etc.? All of these discussions that have permanently been with the societies in the West only take place when artifacts are restituted. That became very clear after the first restitution of modernism, after Napoleon had disappeared and France had to restitute many objects. And in many corners of Europe, these discussions started then, and it took many years until the decision was made what was more important in Germany in the early 19th century. The big question was, do we want more Dürer, Cranach, the German painters, or something else? And all of these discussions are very invigorating, and not just invigorating, but fundamental for societies. And the fact that they can only now get started is extremely positive, including all of the potentially arising fears and tensions, but they have to happen. You can't just hit pause on everything to avoid dangers and difficulties. This needs to be happening.
I mean, I'm going to go to Christian Meister's question. So if they turn on the microphone, but one of the things I want to hold on to right here, which is really beautiful, is your use of that word joy, which is a really beautiful and important thing. As you when we saw that image on the street and the trucks passing, and there is a sense in which it is, you know, that horizon of hope that is always cautious, that is always with tension and doubts. That is the decolonial moment as well, right? So I love that use of the word joy and what that signifies. Christian, go ahead. You can
Christian, darf ich ein Wort?
Christian, may I just throw in one thing to react to what Wayne said? I'm happy that the joy, even though in some groups it might be seen as naive or I don't know, but that the feeling that I also experienced there during this event, one box was slowly pulled out of the truck with a forklift, one out of these 12 boxes, and it took forever because it was done with a lot of caution. It was done very, very carefully, and it almost looked like a birth, a rebirth. Something was taken out or pulled out of the truck. And whenever you welcome a new life in a family, in a community, when a new being comes into a family, the entire set of coordinates changes. And I agree with you, Wayne. There is, this feeling of caution. What is going to happen? A new being, a new situation. You're joyful on the one hand, but you're also excited. You don't know what's going to happen, but it's a new configuration, a new setup. And I was extremely touched by this impression that something was deeply changing because something was being unloaded, or maybe rebirth was a little much.
I want to come back to that. I really want to. Christian, your question, and then I see a question by Larissa. Christian?
Yeah.
Benedict, just very briefly. The act of speaking, sender and recipient, and this basically, I mean, you analyzed the side of the sender, the institution, but what about the side of the recipient? To quote an article, why do people believe lies? So what is happening on the other side, on the side of the recipients, the systemic dimension between the expert and civil society? How is, I mean, for decades, everybody was at ease with this because it took a long time until you came, until this was made an issue. So from an analysis point of view, it was just the recipient side of the lie that you looked at and not the speaker's side and not the recipient. Thank you very much. Your systematic mind has immediately found the gaps, the blind spot in my presentation. I'm not surprised by this at all. And I'm happy about this. Sure, there's the side of the recipient, and there's the in the 70s and 80s, there was a very strong recipient group that didn't believe the lie, that had a different opinion. And in this very quaint museums world of the 1970s and 80s, there were some new players that brought the truth in and changed everything and shook everything up. There were people who had supporters outside in the media. Radio Bremen is among those who, spread a different point of view. In many letters to the editors in the British press, you find critical voices that said, every time we talk about restitution to Africa, you cannot say every time that African rulers were bloodthirsty monsters. This is a narrative that isn't helpful, etc., etc. And you see this on the side of the recipients very much. I do not believe that we are the first ones who have now demanded truth. I think we're equipped because of the digital possibilities to get better access to the information. The general public of the 1970s that already felt that something wasn't right with this system of lies. They couldn't do that. They didn't have the same possibilities of getting access to information. Let me just give you a brief piece of information. When Hildegard Hambrücher herself tried to organize restitution in the 1980s, she sent an employee from Bonn to Dahlem and said, collect information about what's there. And he came back and said, yeah, I only found a photocopy in one room and I'm going to tack that to the wall. I couldn't get any more information than that. And that's the difference between them and us. We have more access and they didn't.
I mean, I love this, Christian. I really think we should continue this part of the conversation at some point because, Benedict, you could also say that if there's a heritage infrastructure that is a lie, then there are some lies that we believe and bind, right? In the 1970s, when a restitution claim came from Jamaica and a museum said, you don't have the conditions for it, Jamaica said, okay, we agree we don't have the conditions for it, right? So there are some lies as recipients that you're a part of the lie itself, right? All right, Larissa, your question?
Dein Mikro ist noch aus.
Benedikt, ganz, ganz herzlichen Dank für dein...
Benedict, thank you very, very much for your interesting presentation of what happened in the past week, the months before that, even the years before that. And I'd like to follow up with this enthusiasm that you've shown, because I think that I am familiar with it. I think I've experienced something similar in 2011 when for the first time human remains were returned to Namibia. This exact same feeling, these pictures that you described, at that time it was the airport in Windhoek, where similar images occurred that were all touching us very much. But following up on this, I'd like to get your perception regarding the future. In the beginning, I understood you were saying that this topic of the lies has been dealt with now because we've succeeded in achieving a breakthrough. If I were to compare this with my experience looking back, 2011, the return of human remains to Namibia was a breakthrough, but the struggle is not over yet. I have the feeling that so many things are still there, so many more things than we who were there in 2011 thought that we would still have to deal with 10 years later. And I'd like to combine this observation with the one that Siraj Sashu made last night when he said for South Africa, he would want to ask the question whether the return of icons like Sarah Bergman to South Africa, he said the iconic returns sometimes cover other things up, push other non-iconic objects into the background, and sometimes push other battles into the background. And without being the devil's advocate here, I want to ask you, where do you possibly, being the one who triggered this debate, who kicked off the entire avalanche and has observed everything, where do you still see difficulties, obstacles, potential tensions in the years to come that still exist or might be re-emerging?
I think there are quite a few of those, but I think things fundamentally changed or shifted. I mean, you might have asked, okay, what obstacles are we going to face after the fall of the Berlin Wall? I mean, yes, things are complicated, and it remained complicated for 20, 30 years, and it will remain complicated for years or for generations to come, but it did shift the very foundations. So I think that these first restitutions of a monumental ensemble of artifacts, so it's not just a couple of artifacts that were stored in a depot on a warehouse. You talked about iconicity, and it's not just an icon, really. I think it's a big part of their cultural heritage that we know about of the Kingdom of Abomey. And the fact that a small country such as Benin, without any quid pro quo, without giving away any gold mines or concessions to gold mines or buying any equipment, without doing any of that, this really was a feat for them, and it remains a very positive development for me. I am deeply convinced, however, that the discussions that are just starting in the Republic of Benin, opening of museums, the negotiations, that is going to be a challenge, of course, but it has to happen, and that's just the way it is. And once they have their own collections, then maybe in 10 or 20 years' time, once the people in the Republic of Benin have seen it, have perceived it, they might be willing to enter into agreements with others to have these collections be shown at other museums. So I think this is really something that changes everything. In my point of view, there's of course very subjective, and I can't really prove that, but my feeling is that this restitution, and Paris Salon still has a lot of artifacts, and they don't just want artifacts from Abomey, but from other regions in order to derive a Republican understanding of cultural heritage. But be that as it may, now I think I've lost what I wanted to actually talk about, but
I think
I
that
lost it.
No, but
Sorry.
here is nice though, because, and I think that I want to hold on to this for the kind of closing comments. But before I do that, because we don't have that much time. Jos van Beerde had a question which I think coincides a little bit with Larissa's question. Jos, you still want to ask it? If so, turn on the mic and yeah, come on, let's see.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get my video.
We see a beautiful picture of you anyway. So you
Okay,
can...
good. Thank you very much for your speech. I'm very happy with the return to the Republic of Benin, but I wonder whether this is really, it's a point of joy, but during the last decades, we have seen more points of joy. For instance, the Indonesian population was extremely happy when the statue of Paramitra was returned in 1978. They were extremely happy in Ethiopia. Crowds were along the road when in 1999, the cross of Lalibela was returned. In 2005, the Axum obelisk. So why is it this moment that is so decisive? And why, for instance, do you not choose the decision of the Belgian government to change the property relations? It's the first country in Europe, the property relations of objects that have been proven to have been stolen, and which is also investigating much more than only objects, also the role of the monarchy, of the enterprises, and of the mission. That's my question.
Ja, Sie haben vollkommen recht.
Yes, you're absolutely right. Of course, what happens in Belgium, or happened since the declaration this summer, that is also something that is a fundamental shift. And I focus on the material return or restitution of these objects because it's what I've experienced in recent months. But there is a connection there, certainly. Of course, there are negotiations taking place that have been ongoing for a couple of years, and it's like a billiard table. You know, you're really moving and shifting pieces around and really shifting others accordingly and as a consequence. So I think overall the whole system is changing and the constellations are changing. And the example in Belgium is quite exciting and interesting, what's happening there. So again, I'm not that much involved in that or knowledgeable enough to talk about this extensively, but thank you very much for pointing this out and mentioning this.
But you know, Bénédicte, I want to hold on to this just because of my own embeddedness in it as a person in the museum, because I think that what you're pointing to, which is important, and you use that word, which I love, is that right now we live in a horizon of possibility. Previous to this, 6 years ago, whenever we spoke in museum circles there, and we talk about provenance research, there was always a feeling of impossibility. It is too big, it cannot be done, there's not enough money, there's this, that. And right now that has shifted. There's a certain shift to it being a horizon of hope of what can be done. So I think I want to hold on to this as what you're saying is not necessarily to just give up or to sit and celebrate, but to hold on to the horizon of hope and push forward. That is what I take from you, right? All right. Yeah. I want to ask you one little question with lies, because in your sketching of the question of lies is also a critique of the notion of expertise. Mm-hmm. Because one of the things you talk about is that particular person who went on and said, I'm an expert. and so I'm interested in that relationship between within the museum as a site for expertise, because that is also one of the challenges that has been coming out now in the decolonial question, is that we are no longer experts. Mm-hmm. Do you have a kind of anything to riff on that idea of questioning of expertise within the museum?
Vielen Dank. Das ist tatsächlich.
Yes, thank you so much. That is very well observed. You would expect, when you think about an expert and what that means, that they would be working in the service of truth. And I think it's very interesting, whenever an expert uses their image or their expertise, in order to move away from that in a completely different direction, not towards transparency. And I think there are expert opinions, or there is expert knowledge, of course, that is out there. But what I'm more interested in, rather than talking about expertise and expert knowledge, is the ethos, the ethics of someone working in a museum that is heading a museum. So, what's your feeling? Like every morning you look in the mirror and you spread these untruths or lies in the name of science and research. And I find that very moving, personally very moving, because I'm convinced that there is an ethics to this profession, and ICOM has been, very involved in developing an ethics of museums. But if you don't have that commitment to historic transparency, I think that doesn't work. It's non-functional, really. And taking a step back, as preparation for our talk tonight, I talked extensively with my colleague, 3 gentlemen at the TU Berlin, and they're experts for the Cameroon cultural heritage and the provenance of these artifacts that are exhibited in the Humboldt Forum. Richard Forcy, Dr. Richard Forcy, for example, with Michael Asli-Kinga and Jan Le Gall and Sebastian Sprote as well. And the idea was to use all the information that is currently present and exhibited in the Cameroon exhibition in the Humboldt Forum, and look at that and decide whether that is actual truth or if it's a lie. And my reaction was that, yes, you should do that at some point, but I think we've taken many steps beyond that. You have to do that as long as there are these obstacles. But right now, I am very optimistically destabilized, you could say.
All right, I want to hold on to one last question from Holger Jeben, and then and I might have to just read the questions that are left. But Holger, do you want to just put forward the question quickly?
Yeah, thank you very much. To put it quickly, ich frage lieber auf Deutsch, es fällt mir leichter.
Okay, so the way I understood you, Ms. Savoy, when you talked about history and the necessity for historic work, becomes superfluous if it works, which would be the case if you've returned these historic artifacts. I would understand this in a way that, what matters is that something is returned, that restitution is the test whether something has been successful or not. On the other hand, you also have this need for the truth to be told. So is there a priority? Is one thing more important than the other? Because I think, this need to really find out the truth, that seemed very interesting to me. Yes, that's a very good question. And you might have noticed that, as Wayne said earlier, that, we were facing impossibilities, not the possible. And we, back then, when we talked about this, we thought that we had a mission impossible to accomplish. So we thought, okay, we might never achieve this. And we then had not the mission impossible, we no longer did that. We had a mission accomplished all of a sudden. And this drive to find transparency, to really uncover the historic facts, that remains. But I personally, after working on this for 4 years, very intense work, I was wondering whether I would want to I would want to continue repeating working on this, and if it becomes repetitive, and whether you might not just find some truth due to the fact that the whole constellation, the whole foundation shifted. And I was really wondering whether I would want to change focus after achieving this big step. I mean, thinking back 4 or 5 years ago, people said, well, do we have a colonial history or heritage in our museums? I mean, it wasn't common knowledge or consensus. And nowadays, you have students in school realizing this. We get requests for interviews from schools that have their exams coming up, and they're focused on these issues. There's been so much information become available, so much being published, so that I feel like this archaeological digging in these archives, maybe that's no longer at the forefront of what we should be doing. But you're quite right, of course. We can't say, okay, mission accomplished, let's stop working on this. And that's not the way I meant it.
All right. We have to end, unfortunately, Benedicte and audience. For many people who know me a little bit, they know my absolute love for the work of Stuart Hall. And right now I'm in a moment with Stuart Hall's work, which is his interest in conjunctures and conjunctural analysis. And in a description of that, Tony Bennett describes his conjuncture as a particular moment, a certain moment when there is hope and there's possibility, but there's also threat and a certain kind of anxiety as well. And I think that is one of the things that you've done for us today. I mean, by thinking through these lies that bind us as cultural institution, if we want to quote Anthony Appiah, you've also set out a demand, an ethical demand for moving beyond that, those kinds of lies, towards thinking through truths that we need to embrace as institution. If anything else I want to take away from today, and I think everybody should take away from today, is that there is hope in this current conjuncture. There is something to fight for in this current conjuncture, that we should see the joy on the street, but perhaps also the work that has been done as a moment to push forward, even while we are skeptical, fearful, doubtful. We still need to put it forward, because that, in essence, is what happened in almost every moment of decolonization. That joy to imagine another kind of future and then fight for it. Thank you, Benedict. This was wonderful. It was actually the first time we've had a conversation in real life. And it's not so real.
Yes. Thank you very much, Wayne. It was a pleasure.
All right. Until next time, thanks to everybody, organizers. Thank you for having us. And the conference continues tomorrow.
Bye-bye.